I'm Andrea Hobley. I'm the president of our local League of Women Voters of our Woodbury Cottage Grove area. I'm very, very excited about our topic tonight. We have been talking about doing this for well over a year. Our speaker is from Mapping Prejudice, and you'll hear a little bit more about her in a moment.
As I said, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a critical lens for us as a League of Women Voters. So this mapping prejudice discussion and presentation by Rebecca is really part of our um, honoring and celebrating that lens with our League of Women. Uh, Rebecca's background, she's the Community Engagement League for the mapping prejudice process. She's responsible for nurturing collaborations between Matching Prejudice, the University of Minnesota libraries, and community organizations, artists, and the change makers working for housing justice and racial equity. Rebecca leads the Mapping Prejudice strategy for engagement with volunteer community map makers, particularly those most impacted by the history of racial covenants and who are at the center of the project story. She designed and facilitated our 2022-23 Community Fellows Program, and it's a model for community creation using the documentation of racially restrictive deeds to advance racial justice. She's a member of the Diversity Community of Practice Collaborative, Mapping Prejudice, Community Advisory Board, and other external coalitions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Give you back that. So since we are testing the hybrid, I also want to say for everybody here, it's daylight savings. So I've been up since 5 instead of 6, right? So I hope you will forgive me to have a chair instead of standing, which is really nice. And I'm gonna I'll just pay attention here too because I'd love to see if I can keep trying. I may have to do this for those here and online. It's getting rid of that bar. I'm not sure why it pops up. Um, so first and foremost, I want to thank you all for inviting me here tonight. And before I begin, I'm going to start with our next slide. Let's see, there we go. I want to recognize that we're situated on Minnesota Makoche. And Minnesota Makoche in the Dakota language means the land where the waters reflect the sky, and it's the traditional homeland of the Dakota people. I also want to acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and time, has been made possible by the unpaid labor, skill, and suffering of enslaved people, primarily of African descent, from a nation that refused to acknowledge their humanity. So we are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice. It's our collective responsibility to start or to continue learning about the history of Minnesota's Dakota and Ojibwe people, to learn about the history of Minnesota's enslaved people and their descendants. And yes, there were enslaved people in the state of Minnesota. And to seek out ways in which we as a community can help repair the harms committed over time and space. Illustrating this line between past and present inequities is critical to our work at Mapping Prejudice. Today, I'm talking about housing equity in the 20th century. So, why do I begin by sharing this beautiful map created by Marlena Miles? Because maps reveal so much. And at the core of my presentation, this is the history of land being reserved for white people. Racial covenants, which I'll share about in a minute, are a form of the same forced historical displacement of Indigenous and African American communities, and they still carry significant effects today. Altogether, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'd like to start by centering us today. The Twin Cities and surrounding areas show up in national magazines hitting the top 10, the best parks, the best biking trails, most livable place to live, and on and on. But it's often lost on Minnesota writers and promoters to add the clause at the end of each of these phrases. For whom? For whom is it most livable? If we claim to be such prosperous cities and counties surrounding the Twin Cities based on all of these qualities, everyone should benefit, right? Yet, when we look at the Twin Cities metro homeownership rates, there are huge disparities. 75% of white people own their own homes, while only 33% of Black families can make the same claim. The Twin Cities has among the highest gaps between Black and white homeownership rates in the nation. So our work at Mapping Prejudice is about examining the roots of this history to make sense of these contemporary statistics. Our current disparities are rooted in a critical turning point at the beginning of the 20th century. And that was the decision to use private contracts to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. These private contracts were called racial covenants, which are clauses that were inserted into property deeds, such as this example, to keep people who are not white from buying or occupying certain pieces of land. For most of the 20th century, they were composed and promoted by a huge cast of characters: realtors, city planners, bankers, and elected officials. Racial covenants worked in concert with other practices like white violence, real estate steering, and redlining to bar non-white people from owning land and homes on the land. So I'm about to read some examples, and I think it's really important to state that the language you're going to see and hear is both racist and painful. I work with so many audiences. I will do that. Just keep telling me that, because it feels like it comes back. It comes back, but I will keep giving me a just so everybody can see the full screen. So I work with a lot of different audiences. And so before reading this language, I talk a little bit about our centers of intelligence. Our head is where our thoughts are, our heart is where our emotions are, and our body holds sensations that our body can react to things. So one of the things that I let people know before we read this really painful language is to pay attention to these three things, and to think about ways in which you can work through the language with some bodily tools that we all have access to. So it's about taking in deep breaths and exhaling. You can wiggle your toes and put your heels on the ground, and that can ground your body. You can even put your palm on your heart and on your forehead as you breathe in. I think what's most important that I say to people is that if you need to take a break or you need to step out or look away, I completely respect that, okay? So the first and earliest racial covenant that we found in Minnesota was put in place in South Minneapolis in 1910. That's when Henry and Lenora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to Nels Anderson, a Swedish baker. The home was extremely modest, but the deed for this property included this racial restriction, which is pictured here and stipulated, quote, "The party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not be at any time conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Said restrictions shall run with the land." So you may not be familiar with this history, but some of you might be familiar with a parallel street along West River Road in Minneapolis named Edmund Boulevard, which was named after him. Walton inserted this language into thousands of other deeds in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, and across Minnesota, hundreds of landowners and developers and city officials followed Walton's lead. They compose dozens of variations on the language that he first put to text. So I'm going to show you some additional examples of racial covenants, and again, I read them not to inflict pain, but rather to bear witness to this practice and this history. So here is one from Washington County that it says, quote, that this lot is sold with the understanding and agreement that it shall never be owned or occupied except by those of the white race. And here's another example from Hennepin County. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And here in number 2, it says that the said property shall not, nor shall any part thereof be conveyed or leased to, or occupied or used by any other person or persons than those of the white Caucasian race. But this provision shall not be construed to prevent occupation of said property by persons of other races when they are employed as servants. So really only white people could use this property, and people who are not white couldn't be on the property unless they were servants. Here you can see the language appear directly in an open advertisement. Quote, forth, that grantee cannot sell or lease said real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. And here is the same advertisement written in Swedish and directed towards new Swedish immigrants. In English or in Swedish, you can see that it's no secret. Covenants are advertised as an amenity, and they send a message as to who gets to participate in whiteness. So looking at and reading the language of these covenants aloud is really the first step if we want to go forward together. We need to confront this racism and acknowledge that it had its intended impact. I say to all audiences, for those who have firsthand experience with the consequences of this text, I hope that the public acknowledgement will affirm your lived experience with these facts. And for the rest of us, we can all respond now to denials that this history did not take place by simply responding with, don't believe me. Look at these primary source documents. You don't have to believe what I say. It's right there in the documents. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made racial covenants illegal. And once this happened, there was a rush to forget, at least among white people. Our team is working at peeling back this intentional amnesia and empowering communities to engage in collective remembering. We're trying to create data to help communities deal with this and ask for change. One important thing to acknowledge about covenants is they were not a secret when they were in use, but rather a selling point. So I've laid the basic foundation of what racial covenants are and where they were located in property records. I'd like to come back to today and again talk about our work and our mission. Mapping Prejudice started in 2016, really as an experiment, merging public history and technology as a transformative narrative about our history of structural racism. Our team resolved to do something no one had ever done before, and that was to build the first ever comprehensive map for an American city around racial covenants. We wanted to know things like, what did racial covenants actually say? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they cover? And we decided to answer these questions in an unconventional way. We took digitized property records from Hennepin County and used computers to flag digitized documents that seemed to have racist language embedded in them. And then we harnessed the power of community. We flagged the digitized property records into a crowdsourcing online platform called Zooniverse. This platform allowed us to invite volunteers from all backgrounds into the work. To date, over 12,500 community members have identified and mapped over 70,000 property records that contain a racial covenant. And when we put this information on a map, this is what we got. See if that'll show up on the big screen. This is our contagion map. And so when you're looking at this contagion map, you can see the spread of racial covenants over time. It starts at the top there. You can see, I'll just tell you, it starts in 1910, and this map will go all the way through 1963. So from a high level, you can see how intentionally adding racial covenants to these property deeds created exclusive spaces for white people. The number of property records we're finding with racial covenants continue to grow across the country. We've mapped covenants in 7 counties in Minnesota: Hennepin, Ramsey, Anoka, Olmsted, Washington, Sherburne, and Dakota, and Milwaukee County around Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Washtenaw County around Ann Arbor, Michigan, and today volunteers are reading deeds from Washington, D.C., Forsyth County that surrounds Winston-Salem in North Carolina, and Contra Costa County that surrounds San Francisco in California. The patterns that are laid down by covenants persist today and define where the best resourced areas are, all defined by where one lives. Where we each live correlates with living wage job market, equitable education opportunities, even access to green space. So I want you to understand how powerful covenants were. Once they were embedded into property deeds, they ran with the land. It didn't matter how many times the property changed hands or what was built on the land. Anyone who broke a covenant, even after the property had changed hands several times, risked ending up in court and losing all the equity they had acquired in the property. A breach triggered a process that put the land back into the hands of the person who put the covenant in the first place. And if that person died, it would go to their heirs. People often ask if there was resistance to white people to these covenants, and this is really significant in acknowledging and owning this history. Covenants had overwhelming support among white people. Opinion surveys in the 1940s showed that most white people in Minnesota believed covenants were beneficial. They believed that racial restrictions protected property values and quote-unquote neighborhood harmony. And I'll show you the last two from Washington County here. So there's an idea that American cities have always been segregated. And the farther back in time you go, the more segregated things were. But that's actually not true. Black people were able to settle in many parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul in the early years. But they were then forced into smaller and smaller areas beginning the teens and into the 1920s. You can start to see the racial covenants show up on the map in green. Neighborhoods with covenants are still the whitest neighborhoods in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and surrounding areas. The pattern established by 1940 through covenants persists today, and here is the map of 2020. As covenants were developing, there was just as many instances of racist white violence over Black-owned property as reported by the Minneapolis newspapers. You can see these examples during the 4-year span between 1908 and 1912. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a threat to fundamental liberty. In Minnesota, Black leaders such as Nellie Francis, who in 1921 led efforts to enact a state anti-lynching law. Lena Olive Smith, who was the first African-American woman licensed to practice law in 1921. And Katie McQuat, who served for 17 years with the St. Paul NAACP and Urban League, and who in 1964 was the first Black candidate to run and win a St. Paul City Council seat. All of these Black women devoted their lives to fighting these practices. These leaders are examples of resistance through the channels through which they had the most agency. There are other stories of Black resistance by courageous individuals. This is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a small bungalow at 4600 Columbus Avenue South in Minneapolis with a contract for deed. This is a 1964 example of a standard contract for deed. For those who don't know what a contract for deed is, it's when the buyer, in this case the Lee family, makes payments to the owner until the house is fully paid off and it legally becomes theirs. Sometimes it's referred to as rent to own. Buyers have all the responsibilities of a homeowner, but at any time, if a mispayment happened, they could lose the house, the original seller could keep the profit, and then create the same arrangement with a new buyer. It was yet another predatory lending practice that impacted Black families all over the country. So what this meant was that the Lee family was in a very vulnerable position. For the Lees, they had an unrecorded contract for deed, which is the quieter route for sellers to profit. So they took a risk to live in a comfortable neighborhood with their family. When the neighbors found out that the Lees, a Black family, were moving in, they organized a stop for sale. They called the realtor, the bank, the city council, and other neighbors. When the Lees ignored the neighborhood threats and moved into their house, they found themselves under attack. Thousands of people gathered around their house. They tried to burn it down, they threatened to murder the Lee family, and they shot out the windows and threw black paint on the siding that you can see up in the left-hand corner, which shows Edith and her kindergarten daughter, Mary. The Lees held on for 2 years, after which time they finally succumbed to the pressure and moved. So before the Lees moved into their neighborhood, there were federal actions that really set the stage for this neighborhood violence they faced. Typically, when purchasing a house in the early 20th century, buyers had to pay for a house within 5 years. When the Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934, it changed the tight timeline in which buyers had to pay in full for their house. The administration created the modern mortgage system in which buyers could pay equal fixed payments over a 15 to 30-year period. This new structure made it more accessible for home buyers. However, this change in practice was not open to Black families. This was because the FHA incorporated racist ideas in their manual, such as opposing quote-unquote mixing of races, which to them meant the decline in property values. And you can see this coded language here, the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. In the 1930s, the federal government paid local housing appraisers nationwide to create city maps of neighborhoods on their risk for lenders. These maps are one example of what we now call the redlining maps. There are many factors that were considered in the grading system, and race was one of them. These maps visually illustrate that racially mixed neighborhoods were not good investment for lenders. Some neighborhoods were described in red as high risk or hazardous, hence the name redlining. Redlining maps pointed to places where getting investments from banks or government agencies was difficult. The creation of the freeway system was yet another strategy and a straightforward way to define spaces. Every American city has a historically Black neighborhood that was, quote, demolished, slashed in two, or cut off from the rest of the city by the highway. And this was not an accident. This map helps us to see that the freeway system was designed to do more than just move cars. It was a social engineering project. The urban interstate highway system was constructed to drive what planners called urban renewal. And urban renewal was more than just the demolition of buildings. As James Baldwin would later declare very directly in a 1963 public television interview, that urban renewal was actually quote unquote Negro removal. Minneapolis and St. Paul were no exception. Vibrant, close knit communities, all of the systemic decisions and intentional acts show enduring demographic patterns. Again, we all should think about what are the things that we have or don't have access to in our own neighborhood. Schools, health, green space. Do we have food sources or food deserts? And even tree canopy. With all of the overlays that I'm showing you tonight, you start to see that access to resources and opportunities is fundamentally based on where we live. The broad outlines of these stories are the same, but the destruction just unfolded in different ways in each of these places. So, looking at various counties, you may also see large sections that don't contain racial covenants. So, it's really important to understand that many other forms of discriminatory practices contributed to the creation of racialized spaces that I want to make sure that I point to, but probably won't cover all of these in this time period that we have together. I think what's most important is to really think about all of these as formal and informal layers versus silos. Sometimes they're very clear and sometimes they're muddled together or they overlap. Our work at Mapping Prejudice focuses not only on identifying and mapping racial covenants, but also unearthing public history narratives that illuminate the racist tools in the system toolbox to keep Black families from home ownership, access to resources, and the ability to pass down generational wealth. Narratives that also illuminate the agency and self determination of Black communities despite external pressures. So, I've shared with you a lot of history and how these systems have interacted over time. I think that humanizing its impact on Black and white families with different embedded but understood rules can be really helpful. So, now I'm going to share a little bit about my family. In 1963, my mom and dad, Scotty and Peter Gillette, bought this house in the Kenwood neighborhood of South Minneapolis. They paid $22,000 with a low interest loan of around 4.5%. They were also helped with a gift of $2,000 from my grandpa as a down payment for the house. And this is not unusual. I think 30% of white families get support from other family members. They had three girls, including me, and while it was an incredible financial stretch to live there, I do recognize the privilege of growing up in Kenwood. So each time a home was sold, my parents could accumulate wealth that they could then invest in their future and that of my two sisters and me. And ultimately, their investments were used to help each of us when we were older and ready to purchase our own homes. The gift from my grandpa, as I said, was not unusual. 30% of white people get, that's a quote that I already shared with you, is that they get help from family members. So I've talked about, let's see if I can hide that again. I've talked about several well-known Black leaders who resisted these racist systems that were intended to create racialized spaces. There's so many more untold stories of Black resistance by courageous individuals that really need to be unearthed in our history. So this is Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers, my mother and father-in-law. I would argue that they were one of the courageous resistors simply by claiming space. They came to Minnesota from Arkansas and Tennessee as part of the Great Migration of African American people seeking opportunity and home ownership for their families in the North. In 1965, after renting off of Lake Street with their three young children, including my husband Daryl, Elsie and Willie Joe purchased this house at 4736 Oakland Avenue on the edge of the Old South Side, the historically Black neighborhood in South Minneapolis. They bought the house on an unrecorded contract for deed for $7,500 with an 18-year term. And here you can see where I grew up versus where my husband grew up, and the houses were bought just 2 years apart in different areas of the city. So I want to put Willie, Joe, and Elsie, my mother-in-law's house in neighborhood in context. Up the block from the Sellers, at 4853 live Belvin and Betty Norris, who bought their house just a few years before my in laws. Their daughter, Michelle Norris, who would become nationally celebrated journalist. You might be familiar with her current work on the Race Card Project, and as I tell young people, or if you're old like me, you might remember her from NPR's All Things Considered. Michelle was born just a few months before Belvin and Betty moved in. Michelle writes in her memoir, quote, "We weren't trying to be activists," my mother said. "We just decided it was time to live someplace nice. We worked hard with white people at the post office who could live where they wanted, and we wanted to do the same thing." Daryl and Michelle lived a block apart and grew up in the same neighborhood. In a neighborhood that Daryl describes just as I did where I grew up, with strong and powerful positive memories. The center of the old South Side was here, 4th Avenue and 38th Street. Field Elementary School, the 38th Street Food Market, the Bethany Missionary Baptist Church, all of places that my husband would frequent. And all of these locations were the connective tissue within the old South Side neighborhood. They were social, religious, and educational spaces, formed despite external forces attempting to create racialized islands in Minneapolis. From within the old South Side came mutual aid, political organizing, art, culture, joy, agency, and education. An incredibly strong relational community. So Elsie and Willie Joe's house is on the old South Side, on the edge. They were not trying to be activists 1 block away from Michelle Norris. They simply wanted a home for their family. If you remember, just a few blocks in the other direction, at 46 in Columbus, you can see the Lee family house that I shared their story a little bit earlier. Notice what maps can tell us. These 3 identified houses do not have covenants on them. But paying attention to the freeway as one barrier on the left-hand side of the screen, and the covenants that surround the neighborhood as another barrier, we often refer to this as the halo effect. There really are covenants within that circle are not necessary because they've already been protected by a barrier. My mother and father-in-law, Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers, made good on those rent-to-own payments, and for financial needs throughout the years, had other mortgage arrangements. At one time in 1987, they took out a 5-year mortgage for roughly $8,000 at an astonishing interest rate of almost 22%. For comparison, an average mortgage rate today is around 7%. I don't see any of that. I'm not sure. Okay, no, it's not. Maybe just in the room. Oh, then there it goes. It's magic. So they hung on to their house until 2013 when they foreclosed because of medical expenses. So after 47 years of my in-laws living in their house, my husband Daryl and 2 sisters walked away with a mere $5,000. So our 2 family narratives are a great illustration of the history of racialized housing and the contemporary impact of the homeownership gap between Black and white families. And this is a picture of my family. We are the children of Scotty and Peter Gillette and Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers. Our family's stories tell on a human level how the system, but really 2 systems, impacted our parents. My mom and dad, Scotty and Peter, who as white people had access to all the resources, were supported by laws and policies, and really had no idea that their world and mine were nothing other than normal. Versus my in-laws, Elsie and Willie Joe, who understood the racist housing playbook that they had to work within, yet resisted until the end. Our parents' experiences also have a direct impact on what wasn't or was passed down to me and my husband, which impacts what we as parents can or cannot pass down in the future to our 2 children when they're ready to purchase a house. Generational wealth that could have potentially supported their futures. Thanks to Black activism and resistance, racial covenants have been illegal everywhere in the country since 1968. That's when the Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which made racial covenants illegal. But the impact was still evident. A year before the Fair Housing Act passed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. published a book in which he prophetically stated, "Many of the ugly pages of American history have been obscured and forgotten. A society is always eager to cover misdeeds with a cloak of forgetfulness. But no society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present. This is why I do my job. This is why Mapping Prejudice does this work, and why presenting this shared history is so important. First and foremost, not to forget the impact of racial covenants today. The history of racial covenants was not about personal choice, it was a system. I come from those who benefited over time, and it's really important to me and our team to help people see and acknowledge who benefited and who was harmed, and how do we mitigate that harm going forward. So I always end with a couple of thoughts. So, what can I do? What can you do? What can we collectively do? Now that we know this history, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? So, what tools do each of us have, and how can we put them to work? So, at the very least, we can tell friends and family what we learned tonight. We can be honest about our institution's role in historically racist practices. And that's something that we want to make sure that we highlight. Mapping Prejudice is based out of the University of Minnesota. And the University of Minnesota also has a history of the land grab from Native people and benefiting, they still benefit economically. They demonstrated racial segregation in the dorms early on and to professors. So we can't really present, I can't really present this if I don't acknowledge where I'm housed, or my work is placed. I think it's really critical to listen and take guidance from people living with the consequences of these policies. You can support, we can all talk about conversations about reparations. And I think it's really important when we talk about reparations. I think people immediately say, what, just like we're going to cut checks to people? Well, that is one way, but there are many other ways. We can think about volunteering. We can think about if we really wanted to spend our money, we could donate to housing nonprofits that give first-time homeowners a down payment assistance. Habitat for Humanity is a great example of that. You can join a community mapping session. So I lead and facilitate our mapping sessions that you can learn exactly how to read the deeds, how to locate the racial covenants, and then help us to map that. And that will help you to kind of see those primary sources and be a part of that conversation. And I can tell you dozens and dozens of stories of how community actually organically came up with their own ideas of what they could do, which we could have never imagined. So our work is really about twofold, is finding the racial covenants, mapping them, and then having dialogue or conversations that we're having tonight. And so I just want to thank you all so much for allowing me to come, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have for me, either on the chat function or in person. Yes. Yes. I'll try to repeat the questions from the room. The question is there a process to remove the covenants? So that's a really simple question. Excellent. Most people want to know that. There is a process called discharging your racial covenant, and what it entails is getting some legal help to create a legal document that can then be attached to your property record packet that you get when you buy a house. And then you file it at your local county recorder's office. And we used to have, because we've grown so much, there was usually just a single kind of explanation, but it really depends on the county that you're in. Each county handles it a little bit differently. Some counties have waived the filing fee. Some counties have decided that they are discharged at the moment that a purchase agreement has been signed, right? So usually the follow-up question then is, does that hold? Is that legally binding? And honestly, we don't know, right? It is a legal document. So what's most important, I always say, so it doesn't mean don't do that. What it means is that individuals are symbolically taking a stand and saying, I live in this house, I found I have a racial covenant on it, and my family disavows this racist history, and we want to take a symbolic approach. And what is really beautiful about it is, let's say I had one on my house and I got the document attached, and then I sold the house to you, and then you sold it to another generation, and 100 years from now, when someone buys that house, they see the racist language of that time, and they also see somebody who did something, who took a stand and said, we don't agree with this history. So it can be really powerful, even though we don't know, and frankly, we don't know, like, lots of changing right now in our politics. So but for now, 1968 Fair Housing Act has stood, and so they are illegal at this point. Yes.
I thank you for what you've added to my knowledge. I don't know much about this, but I read a really helpful book called The Color of Law. And one thing I felt so naive, I did not understand the active part of the federal government in building this. I thought it came from the private market, but it was absolutely condoned, encouraged.
So the question was, a participant here read the book The Color of Law, which is a great book. And it talks about the role of the federal government in this history. And I think what's really important is the layers that I showed you. So some people, so yes, when you think of the realtors, and when you think of redlining, and you can think of things today, gerrymandering, you can talk about real estate steering, you can, so there isn't one, I would say racial covenants, what's important about covenants is they were foundational and they ran with the land. So this is when property developers haven't even built a house. So that's where it's fundamental, but there were many other parts of this that came into play. I'll give you another example, which um, I've spoken a lot in St. Paul, and I think there is a sense, because it's such a horrible history, to say, wow, when we look at that St. Paul map, there's no racial covenants. Phew, we're not racist, you know? And I always say, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there was a higher concentration of KKK involvement in St. Paul versus Minneapolis, right? So it's not as easy as, is there a covenant? Remember, I showed you the halo effect, there's highways and the federal government that played a role.
In how they would give the money.
Yes, yes. And in the laws that took place. So each state, it was Shelley v. Kramer that said they were no longer enforceable, and each state decided what they wanted to do with that. So there's all sorts of, each state had different years that they then passed a law that said that they were illegal. So it wasn't until the federal government passed that final that it was across the board. It's a great book to read. Yes. We have. So we don't know why. Sometimes, oh, I'm sorry. Yes. The question was, have we found any racial covenants that were put into place or at least documented past 1968? So you also have to think about land development, and that the later the land is developed, you start to cross over that 1968 threshold. I don't know if Cottage Grove, where we are, might have, if there's newer construction, then you may not have that here. Um, but we do have examples of that, and we don't know if it just slipped through the county recorder's office, that nobody changed the forms. Was it one maybe bad apple in the mix who put it in? They weren't enforceable, they were illegal, but we have seen them. Not many, but few. So that's a great question. Other questions?
Um, so from a document standpoint, Is it attached to the deed? Is it within the deed? Is it?
So the question was, is it attached to the deed? Is it within the deed? It is within the deed. Now, sometimes you will buy a house, and I think they go back, sometimes you'll find they only go back 40 years. So you may not see it in your packet, and you have to go a little bit further back, but it is in the county recorder's office. It is there. And any of you can go to our interactive map, which I'd be happy to show you. You can plug in your address, and it would that be helpful if I showed? Okay, let's do that. And I think everybody can see, okay, so I'm gonna move this a little bit so I can get in.
Does anyone in the room have like a particularly, oh, because I know like my house is 1989. So,
Okay,
you know,
I'll plug in one,
yeah. And I'll,
okay, so is it before 68, do you think? Okay, so we'll take a look. So here's the racial covenants. If you go to our homepage, mappingprejudice.umn.edu, I'll go to the drop down to maps and data, and I'm going to scroll down here, and here is an interactive map, and I'll just show you. You can zoom in. See how when I get closer and closer, those little polygons. So that's why when I showed you that contagion map, that's a really high level, but think about this on a granular level. So you can zoom in and out. We've done Rochester, St. Cloud, and I think there might be another county if you want to jump to that, if you're ever curious. And then up in the left-hand corner, there's a little hourglass, and this is where we'll put in an address. So why don't you, 81, 91. Is that it right there at the top? Oh, hold on. Grab the. So what it does is it drops a pin right on this location, and there is no covenant on that house, right? Oh, interesting. Okay. Oh, interesting. So what I'll do, let me just show you a different one. Let's see if I can remember. Where is Park Terrace? I meant to say Park Terrace because I know there is not. Nope. It is like 98%. I will show you here though. Let me give you just one other example. So, okay, so now we're in Minneapolis, and you can see I've clicked on this address. This is a green neighborhood, and the lot that it's on has a pin. And if I click on the pin, this will open up a pop-up, and it shows you all the information that community members have gathered that people, so if this were my house, I can read what is the covenant, who bought it, who sold it, and even the document number. Now, to your question, I can't say definitively for this, but like, so why do some of these have covenants and yet some don't on the same block? Sometimes it depends, so I can't give you, but sometimes the documents might be a little fuzzy, so we get digitized property records and we're not going to make anything up. But you can either assume if an entire block except one lot doesn't have one, it probably did have one, but we want to be really accurate with our data. And then also remember, again, what we talked about is like, what's going on in this neighborhood, right? If I'm a Black family, do I want to move into this area? I mean, that would be, you'd have to have a lot of strength, like the Lee family or somebody who said, okay, I want to live in this neighborhood. And yeah, and they are still houses, neighborhoods with covenants are still the whitest neighborhoods, and so they haven't changed. So that tells us also about how structural this was and the lasting impact of that. Oh, 844. St. Paul, Minnesota, I think is right there. So let's click on that. And no. But look at, there's one, we call that a single swear word. who put that in, who's just like, I'm gonna just do everything I can for my one house, right? Yes.
My, one,
Hold on, I'm, 1533.
mom,
There it is, St. Paul?
yes,
No, but you can see you're close to a neighborhood. But you're by McAllister, yeah.
yes, but my house was a parsonage next to the church. I was gonna have a heart attack.
Oh. We have found a number of schools that were on covenanted land. I'm trying to think if there's been a church. But remember often that, yeah, that would be tough, wouldn't it? Yeah, yeah. So other questions that you might have? Yes.
I was actually gonna ask if you look out,
Yep.
there was a really big block that looks like it's where Freedom is. Does Freedom have a covenant?
Can you tell me where that is?
Paul? So if you go up to where it says St. Paul and follow what's now 94 out to the,
This way?
that one, there's right there. It's just one big block. It doesn't look like a neighborhood. Well, you know what? It's right on the lake. Oh,
It was probably filled in. It was, or dredged,
okay.
I think what I meant.
So Freon is on the other side of Sudbury, so it's actually not Freon, but it's the land right across the street. Around the area.
Yeah.
Some of those valuable areas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Expensive.
That's right. So when you think of expensive areas at that time, no need to put a covenant because we're talking socioeconomic. And so when you think of, for example, African American families who are moving north, it'd be very rare that they have the means to buy a mansion in some of the wealthy neighborhoods, right? So that's why I say there are other forces at play, and they all kind of work together to strengthen this. Yeah, well, I'm gonna because now you all are gonna you have to go home now and look at this map.
Sure. Well, here's actually one just came in. Any state legislators talking about preemption on
Yeah.
racial covenants?
Well, so here is the I don't know if I'm gonna answer this directly. This was a question on Zoom that said, is there any state legislator who's doing something preemptively? Did I say that? So I hope I don't switch this a little bit, but when we talk about it again, people say, well, what can we do? I gave you a little bit of a list, but you can pay attention to what's happening in your neighborhood association newsletter. Are you a welcoming neighborhood? Do you make sure that, you tap down on anybody who says something that's coded language or not welcoming? The data has been used. So again, we are not political and that we're not at the legislature, but I will say if you're familiar with, say, the 2040 plan, don't know if you're for or against, but a lot of our data was used as foundational material to advocate that. We didn't advocate it, but legislators did. I'll tell you a really happy story as of Saturday. So if you look at Edmond Boulevard, which I can show you here, this area is full of covenants. Let's see if anybody can see. So this was Edmond Boulevard, and the Longfellow community, you see how all those covenants, they found out about 5 years ago that there were a neighborhood full of covenants, and they organized. They got together and they said, first, we want to have everybody know if they have a covenant on their house. Then they got together and said, how can we discharge? How can we help people to make it really easy? So they do community meetings and gather people and have the covenants discharged. And then they said, this is a stain. This name Edmond Boulevard is a stain on our community. So then they worked to say, let's change the name of the street, right? Got together, worked together. I was on the committee, so I know this. Then there was the name changing. So what is going to be the name that they change it to? So they did door knocking. They put postcards under doors. They had a vote for what the name was. And the winner was, as we just unveiled it on Saturday, Lena Olive Smith, who is an African-American woman, lawyer, who fought racial housing discrimination. And if you look down here, you can see it is now Lena Smith Boulevard. We went to the city council about 4 months ago, and there was an open session where community members had 2 minutes each to voice. The place was flooded, and the most beautiful kind of for me was to see the 14-year-old go up to the mic and say, I don't want to live on a street with this horrible name. And so what's really beautiful is that we will document, I said, because I spoke at the event when we unveiled, is this idea of remembering history, but not honoring people who did things that were wrong. And so now we can all be proud of that street name because it's after somebody who really, a woman, right? Also like, right? so, but these are things that they did this. We didn't do this. So people have the power to learn this history and say, I want to do something. I'm a lawyer, so I want to maybe do I'll tell you pro bono work to help people discharge. There were artists who said, well, we could draw, we know how to paint, we do beautiful work. We're going to create lawn signs. And anybody who does a discharge on the racial covenant will get a lawn sign that's saying, I had a racial covenant and I discharged it. And anybody who bought the lawn signs, the money went to a land trust for first-time home buyers. So it was like this amazing sort of, cyclical thing. There's been plays, we did an art shanty, we've done, I mean, it's really pretty amazing. But it's the power of community. It really is the power of community. Again, 12,500 people that have helped us do this. I'm gonna even go here before anybody even thinks to ask this question because we get this question all the time. Why not AI? Get AI to just do it. And our philosophy is the power is in the individual experiencing this. Yeah, we could get AI. We could figure out a way to just, but then we lose all of the conversations, so that is not one of our values, and we are not going to do that. So, yes. Oh, um, I don't have a specific place that I can point to, but absolutely that people stage their houses to look as though there's a white family living in it. I mean, there's documentation of that, right? Um, and my family has experienced something that in the renter area because I was the one who got it instead of my husband. So it's true. That's another thing. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I will. Let's see if I can. So I'm going to try to draw you all to, see, I think this one.
Well, if you could repeat the.
Oh, the question was about other locations across the country. And so I'm going to point to another part of our map that is Covenants Research Nationwide. So there is other cities that have been done. So we believe that all of this public history, this data is everybody's. We don't want to own it. We want it to be so. Some people do their own mapping projects across the country. Great. It would take us 50 lifetimes to do all of that. So that's wonderful. We have developed sort of a model where we will say to other cities who reach out to us, or counties, I should say, that they just want the code. Can they just take, great, here's the code, you can download it, you can do, or we create a contract where they pay us, but it's not to profit, it's really just our time, where we will actually get volunteers from across the country, because right now we're doing Contra Costa County, and so twice a month, I get people from all around the country that show up on the Zoom call to help with all of these processes. So we will do that work for them, and then they do the mapping. So there's kind of a different menu of options. Now I will say, I would be remiss if I didn't. I don't plan this, but we're based out of the University of Minnesota, but we're not funded by the University of Minnesota. So right now we are living off of a Mellon Foundation grant, and thankfully that there's nothing that has touched that, but it runs out in June. and we don't have another funding source. So we are, if anybody has any really great ideas, you just send those on to us of who we should reach out to. Because as you know, a lot of the foundation work too is that people are now all, everybody's kind of fighting for the same pot of money as well. So, so we're hopeful. We're hopeful, and because the work, we have lots more work to do. Yeah. Yeah. There's a question or just a comment from the audience about AI and that she's reading a book that talks about that there's bias within AI. And I think that's important. I mean, I don't mean to make AI the evil, but it's like it can be used for good. It can be used for, there's pluses and minuses around that. I do want to show you, and then I'm happy to answer if there's any other questions, but I don't want to keep you here all night. But since I talked about resources, so we have a number of things. We have a resource library that you can look here. I'm going to click on that, see if that's slow. Where we will put different articles, and if there's any media. I wanted to point out here that if you click on the Mapping Prejudice LibGuide, I worked with it because we are a library. We love our librarians. So I worked with a librarian to create a LibGuide that would give you, if you wanted books like Color of Law, if you wanted books or articles or video, and she helped me, the two of us, or we curated this so that there were no paywalls, because I don't know if you know, at university oftentimes people can't, you have to pay to get this. So I said it's very important that this is for the community. So anything on that in that LibGuide you can access. The other piece, so you could dig through there, and I want to just also show, because I mentioned this in my, hang on, I'm always really bad at stories from that. So if you are somebody who's visual and wants some reading, but not tons, you can, here's the story of the house that you built. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with story maps, but they're really nice because you can do this where you scroll through and you get some writing and some visuals. So it's like a little bit of your own movie in a sense, but you can go as slow or as fast as you want. And that'll tell you the history of the University of Minnesota's role in this. But there's lots of other story maps as well. Stark's Barbershop. We're also historians. So my colleague, Mike Corey, who is on our team, he's our geospatial technical lead. He's also a historian. And so he has created this about the story that he uncovered about the Stark's Barbershop. Because we also say that as we do this mapping, we're also uncovering, we get a little nugget of something, and then everybody wants to go down the rabbit hole to find out what's that story. And so this is one of the many stories. You can see History of Race and Place in South Minneapolis. Bring Back 6th Avenue North is a huge endeavor, because 6th Avenue North that ran through North Minneapolis was the hub of the Jewish community, Black community, jazz, arts, and it was destroyed by Olson Memorial Highway. So that story map tells you about, so there's just great green space, white space. How did green space overlay with mapping? So you guys you've got enough to read and and learn as you want. So any other final questions? Happy to answer, but I don't want to keep you all night either.
You could just tell to the people that are online, I just uploaded the handout.
So nice, thank you. So all of the handouts that were handed out today are also uploaded for all of you on the Zoom call. I would welcome any of you. We have 2 mapping sessions per month. One is at noon to catch people during the lunch hour. One is at 7 if you're a 9 to 5er. It's open. You just have to have a computer, and we take you through the process. We tell people if you want to come back and you still don't understand, you can sign up many times. Some people go away for a year, they've forgotten, and you can register online. You can find a date that works for you. So I hope you'll join us sometime. Thank you so much. And thank you for all your work, those of you who are working tomorrow. Big day for everybody, isn't it? Oh, yes.
Yeah. Let's see, Mayor.
We'll just do this.
Okay.
Oh, wait, we're not quite done yet for the people on Zoom too.
I just wanted to, first of all, thank Rebecca. It's really been an excellent overview, and you all have been doing so much. How many years has this been going? Almost 10 years, which is just fabulous. It really is.
Yeah.
And it's really great to see the resources that are available. We're just, it sounds like tapping into the very beginning
Yeah.
and getting our toe in the
That's
water.
right.
So it'll be a wonderful opportunity for us to continue learning and growing. I'm going to turn it over to Andrea now.
Oh yeah, I'm told to stop sharing and then I just have some announcements here. So one thing is I was told someone can't open the files of the handouts that I opened. So if you all connect through the chat, we'll keep the Zoom open and I can make sure we can get those. The other thing is I just wanted to go through our upcoming programs. So in chronological order here, there's a mix of League of Women Voters, Woodbury Cottage Grove area and other areas. So the White Bear Lake area league has a hot topics program. The complex role of county commissioners, that's on November 12th. For I know our members, it's in our newsletter that just went out today. And then if you're on here from White Bear Lake area, because I know a number of you are also crossover into Washington County, that I think it's also on your website and in other sources. November 17th is our member social. So if you're a member of Woodbury Cottage Grove area, we're having a member social at the Alamo Draft House. That's a Monday night, and we would be happy to see you. Those details are also in the newsletter. November 20th, our state league is hosting a screening of the film Join or Die, Power of Connection and Democracy, and that's located in St. Paul. So that's in our newsletter, but also on the state league website. November 22nd, book club, How to Know a Person, the Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Seen. And I think the book on AI that was mentioned during the program is our next January book club book, right? Yeah. Last one, December 6th, Saturday morning is our holiday brunch and legislative preview, and watch for sign up